In my nearly 30 years of existence, I've done a considerable amount of driving, and as is expected while on the road, I've encountered my fair share of terrible weather. Everyone handles such things differently behind the wheel. Some people choose to hide under a bridge, while others try to outrun or outmaneuver a storm. I wouldn't consider myself to be a daredevil by any means. However, I hate driving delays, so 9 times out of 10, I'm pushing through come hell or high water. But once upon a time, on a remote highway on the Texas-New Mexico border, my whole perspective on perilous road conditions was turned upside down. After spending spring break on the East Coast with some good friends, I had a massive road trip in front of me. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina to Lake City, Colorado, where my first post-college job was scheduled to begin immediately following the break. My planned route, just shy of 2,000 miles, was intimidating to say the least. And while I had complete faith that my trusty little Corolla could make the journey without a hiccup, the fact that I had filled most of the interior with every earthly possession I owned at the time brought the stakes up by just a little bit. My first full stop along the way was in Arkansas, which I kind of saw as a solid middle point in a way. My goal was to wake up early the next morning and drive the rest of the way to Colorado. After resting for a good while, I woke up refreshed and ready for the road ahead. Unfortunately, I checked the weather and discovered that, it wasn't going to be very pretty. A massive winter storm system was rapidly making its way southeast directly into my line of travel, so in an attempt to avoid some of the more extreme conditions being forecast, I decided to cut south through Oklahoma. For a time, this maneuver seemed to work out perfectly. The sky was undeniably ominous, but mostly what I was seeing was harsh wind and rain. Nothing I haven't dealt with before. But after crossing about 95% of the panhandle, my confidence began to wane a little bit. For those who are unaware, a good chunk of the Texas panhandle is like a giant pancake covered in dirt, cows, more dirt, little bitty shrubs that are incredibly uncomfortable to fall into, and a bunch of small towns with hilariously ironic names that are oftentimes spread out quite a bit. Because of this, you can stand in one spot, swivel your head back and forth, and see for miles in any one direction. So, as I barreled along at an insane speed limit, thanks Texas, I saw this ginormous grayish-brown cloud forming far in the distance, and I could tell even from where I was, when I eventually arrived at it, it wasn't gonna be pretty. But I was determined to at least get to Trinidad, Colorado before that sun went down. A few miles outside a small border town aptly named Texline, things got real serious real quick. All of a sudden, snow began to fall. Sideways, which I didn't expect, and within seconds, I could barely see past the vehicle directly in front of me, which I then decided, unbeknownst to that driver, to task with the modest responsibility of rescuing me if for some reason I went off the road. We slowly crawled along until finally our merry little band of strangers rolled into Texline. And after stopping at the only gas station in town to fill up, I began to weigh my options. Press on towards New Mexico or try to find somewhere nearby to hunker down until things blew over. Well, turns out on that day, I was feeling real confident because once I returned the nozzle to its rightful resting place on the gas pump, I hit the road. And it did not take me long before I realized I was actually the only person headed out of town. So that made me feel great about my ability to make a smart decision. Within minutes of leaving, the road in front of me completely disappeared and I could not see a single thing. I rolled forward at a walking pace for maybe a mile or two until eventually I had to stop. I couldn't even tell if I was on the road anymore. It was at this point that my priority shifted slightly from making it to Colorado to not dying in a whiteout in the middle of nowhere. After some slight adjustments to the GPS system, my new destination was a modest little town called Clayton, New Mexico, which apparently was roughly 6 miles somewhere out in front of me. As I began to crawl forward, I rolled down the driver's side window, poked my head out, and tried to see if eliminating the windshield from my field of view helped at all. It didn't help in the slightest, but eventually there was a brief lull in the storm, and I was finally able to confirm that I was indeed still on the road. With this new surge of positive reinforcement, I started to move a little quicker, and eventually, after what felt like an hour, I began to see objects looming in the distance. I had safely arrived in Clayton. Oh, that was a nail biter. Oh, did you think that was the end of my little adventure? No. The weather forecast for that night was an intimidating combination of snow, sleet, howling winds, and freezing temperatures for the next 6 to 8 hours, so it should come as no surprise when finding adequate shelter was the next objective on my agenda. Thankfully, there's a handful of places to stay in Clayton, so initially this wasn't a cause for concern, but after visiting 3 different motels in the area with no luck whatsoever, the desk clerk at the 3rd motel was kind enough to call the remaining 2 I hadn't visited yet, only to find out that they also were completely booked up. At this point, I definitely started to get pretty desperate, and I remember asking the lady behind the desk if they perhaps had a conference room or something I could crash in, and yeah, apparently they didn't. So I cracked an incredibly cheesy joke about feeling like Mary and Joseph during their visit to Bethlehem, which garnered uproarious laughter from the desk clerk, then left the motel defeated. After talking on the phone with my parents for just a bit, I began to drive around aimlessly looking for something, anything, until eventually I came across a small area designated for camping. Shockingly, the place was a ghost town. No one else wanted to sleep under the stars that night for some odd reason. But I didn't know what else to do, so I began to reluctantly gather up my sleeping bag, tent, extra jackets, and whatnot, when suddenly my phone rang. It was my folks again, and apparently they found out that the local Baptist church had opened their doors to any stranded travelers in town, which at that specific moment definitely described me. When I arrived, the place was hopping. Well over 100 people scattered throughout different sections of the building who came from all over the country. There was food, fellowship, free Wi-Fi, and best of all, safety from the storm. The moral of this story is if you ever find yourself stranded in a distant land and there's no room for you in the inn, try the local Baptist church. Just remember to bring something for head support if you're going to sleep on a pew. A hymnal wrapped in a jacket is no substitute for a pillow.
1, 2, 3.